We're going to talk about the second DYS album, the self-titled record. The second DYS album was released on Modern Method Records in 1985. And it's been a divisive record in hardcore since it came out. In Boston at the time, well, probably going back to early 1984, the hardcore bands, at least the four bands that released music on Exclaim Records, SSD, the FUs, Jerry's Kids, and DYS, were all maturing into something different. And really, when you think about these four bands, people will talk about the Boston hardcore sound, but all these bands really couldn't be any different, SSD's Kids Will Have Their Say, was like this speed of light, razor sharp, just punch to the face, essentially putting Boston on the map. The FU's Kill for Christ is, a fun, loose punk rock party that's, over in 16 minutes. And then the third Exclaim release, SSD's Get It Away, is this sort of dark wall of just cacophonous sound. And it's, probably one of the most important straight edge hardcore records, at least until bands like Judge and Youth of Today and bands like that started showing up. Exclaim 4, the first DYS record, Brotherhood, is, a straight edge classic and sort of the epitome of, Boston hardcore when people want to talk about that sound. And that's sort of the sound that bands like Youth of Today and Crippled Youth adopted. When I got into hardcore, it was early 1984 when I first started seeing bands, so I missed some of these bands doing their classic, hardcore stuff like SSD, DYS. So fast forward a few years later, when Youth of Today first played The Rat and Crippled Youth, and, subsequent shows by both of those bands, at the time, I was 16 or 17 years old. And I remember at the time thinking, this sort of has the spirit of what I imagine it was like in 1982 to be at, the Gallery East and seeing, Negative Effects and SSD and the Bad, or whoever, would play at all those classic places. So it had that vibe. And, Youth of Today was, big in bringing that whole world back. Getting back to Exclaim though, the second FU's record, My America, another blast of hardcore with, smart, funny lyrics, a lot of tongue-in-cheek stuff on there, and, a great cover of We're an American Band by Grand Funk. And just like, on some days that's my favorite record on Exclaim, but, most days it's Jerry's Kids, Is This My World, which is sort of this, I talked about it on I think the second one of these, talk about the collection episodes. I talk about that record and how important that record was to me. But it's just like this out of this world wall of sound, and just, arguably one of the best hardcore albums ever. And if you saw them live any time, same deal, just like, this amazing band. And Jerry's Kids actually, would probably be the only one out of these four bands that sort of kept to the fast hardcore thing, even getting even more fast on the second record, Kill, Kill, Kill. It was the FUs, though, with their third record, Do We Really Want to Hurt You, and SSD's third record, How We Rock, where they would change their sound up to, some people would call it metal, but when I listen to these records now, it's, sort of a logical progression. How We Rock is a hardcore record, and I'll die on that hill, so sorry. Sonically, it makes sense to me coming right after Get It Away. They kind of drop the straight edge lyrics, or at least, let you decide for yourself, check, look at the lyrics to the song, The Choice. Not everyone was happy with these bands changing their music and changing their sound. And, this would be sort of my first experience of being a fan of music where other fans would accuse bands of selling out or, turning their backs on the band, sort of like people would accuse Metallica when they released the Black Album. At the time in Boston, there were two big fanzines, and one of them was very supportive of what DYS were doing, and the other one, not so much. To prepare for this episode, I read through the excellent XXX fanzine book that was released a few years ago. And I kind of just went through all the content in there on DYS, from the stuff in the scene reports at the Boston scene report at the beginning of every episode, every issue, which I always love those. He would kind of go through the bands, labels, venues, people, albums coming out, upcoming shows, that kind of stuff. And so I went through that, and I was hoping to find some anecdotes on the record, or just anything I didn't know about it, particularly about two particular songs, but I'll get into that in a few minutes. But it was nice reading through the book, because at the time, I feel like my opinions on the record aligned with Mike Gitter, who's XXX fanzine here that we're talking about. My small zine at the time, One Step Forward, reviewed this DYS record. Even though I said Dave Smalley sounded like Paul Stanley, I was like 14 when I wrote this. I put it on my best of the year list, so there. And to this day, I'll still defend this record. So yeah, speaking of that, let's actually talk about the actual record now. The first time I saw DYS live was at the Paradise on June 16th, 1984 with Sorry, who, on a side note, I'm going to do an episode on their record, Imaginary Friend, which I'm working on. Psycho, who also, second side note, I just did an episode on their first EP. Check it out. Link in the thing. And they did a bunch of songs from this record, including some people said a questionable cover of Everybody Wants Some by Van Halen, which, was fun. But it's, I think right after Dave Smalley says we learned this song the night before, and, it does kind of sound like they learned it the night before. I mentioned earlier I wanted to find information on two specific songs. One of them is untitled on the bootleg, so I have a bootleg recording of this, that show. And there's an untitled song on there that the beginning of it kind of sounds like the FU's Young Fast Iranians. And the recording of the quality of the recording isn't great. So the only lyrics I can really decipher is, I think he says, maybe we're just growing up. There was a review of a show from maybe a year later when DYS played with 76% Uncertain, and where Mike Gitter mentioned a new song called Shadows. But this being like a year later, I don't know if it's the same song. And the other song I had a question about was Late Night, because that 1984 bootleg version, the lyrics are, at least to me, sound completely different than what happens on the album. And the album was recorded, 2 months after that show in June. They recorded it in August and September of 1984. And so it makes sense that maybe they were, working through the lyrics, and Dave switched them up. You can call this record a metal record or a hardcore record or a rock record. Either way, it's, one of my favorite records. And I'm happy to call it all three of those things depending on, the context or angle I'm trying to talk about the record in. The cover, which was part of a painting that was also used on that weird Black Sabbath's Greatest Hits record you always see in stores. It just looked like it was like a K-Tel record or something. And it says on here that it was used by permission of the Prado Museum in Madrid, Spain. And FYI, it wasn't actually. But don't say anything. The back of the cover may have caused some of the backlash against the band and record at the time. The band pictures Dave Smalley, now listed as D. Christian Smalley, is shirtless with a lizard on his shoulder. And John Anastas appears to have eyeliner on. And you know what? I'm not going to knock any of this kind of stuff. I wore bangles on my wrist. I had those dyed blonde bangs that kids had. I had a mustache. When we're young, we try looks out. Who cares? Let's talk about the music instead. The first thing you notice when this record kicks in with the intro to Late Night is how heavy and right in the mix the bass is. It was on Brotherhood as well, but, gone is that overdriven, distorted bass. Which I love. I mean, the song Open Up. I mean, come on. This could be as a result of the producers Alvin Long and Don Foote. Don Foot from Boston new wave bands Down Avenue and November Group. Both of these bands had some, bass-driven songs, so perhaps they were extra friendly with the bass levels knob. But also, and it's more likely that John Anastas has just improved as a player at this point, because there's, some busy bass lines throughout this record that, aren't obnoxious and don't stray from the feel of the song. Definitely one of my favorite songs about this record, and is John's bass playing, which you don't hear many people talking about. So when Dave Smalley first shows up in Late Night, the first song, it's definitely a different style of singing than he had on Brotherhood. But, here's the thing about Dave Smalley. Whether he's in, DYS, All, Dag Nasty, Down by Law, The Bandoliers, and Don't Sleep. It's Dave Smalley. Well, for that one time, it was D. Christian Smalley, for that one record. This record. And, but some of the best singers around are ones that can, sing in a completely different style or voice, but it's always, it's always recognizable as them. H.R., Robert Plant, Rob Halford, Ian Gillan, you know what I mean. On the bootleg, I have of that Paradise Show from 1984. He sings a lot of these songs with the more gravelly style that he used on Brotherhood, and going in between that, and, you can tell he's kind of getting comfortable with the more, clean, higher singing, and, it sounds great. I just wish the quality was better on the bootleg. This record has 8 songs. One which could be considered a ballad, but it's really just the beginning with a lot of, hard rock and metal bands were doing at the time. The nice quiet part that builds up to the rocking conclusion. Like when we all wound on down the road with Led Zeppelin, or, when time stood still in the sanitarium with Metallica. Closer Still, which closes the first side, is this song, and I like it. Maybe not my favorite song on the record, but definitely one of the songs that may have turned people off for being a quote unquote ballad. I don't know the whole end of the song is epic, and Smalley has his best performance on the record on this song, in my opinion. I always thought of this record as something completely removed from Brotherhood and that style, but when DYS played the Gallery East reunion show in August of 2010 in Revere, Mass, I heard the songs from this record mixed into a set with songs from Brotherhood, and it all clicked. Which Side Am I, No Pain, No Gain, Graffiti. These are, straight up hardcore songs, simple and to the point riffs, but written by, guys that were, getting better at their instruments and getting better at crafting songs, in 84. My favorite on this record goes between Echoes and Which Side Am I. I tend to listen to it all in one sitting at this point. It's about, a half hour long. And hey, if you're not familiar with this one, or if you've always held out on this one or heard it years ago and didn't like it, give it another shot, or find that live set from the Gallery East reunion. Bridge 9 released it as a record a while back, and it's on streaming. And, you can hear what I mean by hearing all those songs, intertwined together, and how much more it makes sense to hear all that stuff together. Definitely a favorite of mine. Great Boston band. Second DYS album, just called DYS. You can probably find it for pretty cheap. Go seek it out. Good stuff. Thanks for watching.